Today, Carol, the first girlfriend and love of Cliff Richard, tells the story how the 20-year-old singer banged at her door, threw stones at the window, then went upstairs to her bedroom and made love to her while she was still in her curlers. Everybody had curlers in them days. That was Carol Costa. Carol kept the affair secret for more than 20 years and stifled her truth emotions about it. She told the story of how they met and fell in love, how he protected and cared for her, and how he used to flick excitedly through the property pages of Country Life to pick out a house where they could live. She thought that she might later in life become Lady Richard to the Knighted Star. It makes her laugh now, but back then she believed that they would marry and have children. It wasn't just naivety, she says. Everything we talked about, he made me believe we'd spend our lives together. Carol first met Cliff in 1958 when she chaperoned her younger sister to a concert in London, Chiswick Empire. Jet Harris spotted them sipping Coca-Cola in the bar and took an instant shine to the dyed blonde. Jet took Carol backstage and introduced her to Cliff. He was just a young guy, a young teenager called Harry Webb at the time. A new boy with the Drifters. In a recent biography, Cliff reveals about the alluring young blonde, to whom he lost his virginity. It's contained within a few paragraphs. He dismisses the affair as a mere infatuation, claiming that what happened between them was not right and painting her as a seductress, which is completely wrong. She later married Jet Harris. It caused a rift between Jet and Cliff, but that wasn't the reason why Jet left the Shadows. And I'll put a link in the description below of the story, my story with Jet Harris. Before we get back to the story of the girls in Cliff's early life, I want to tell you why I think I'm qualified to tell you these stories. Firstly, I had Jet Harris in my band. They were called Vintage for 2 years. And also had the pleasure of singing with Cliff briefly and having a long conversation with him down in London. And we talked a lot about life. I have an affinity with Cliff. I have an affinity with Cliff Richard. It started when I was very young. I was at home quite a lot in my early days, suffering from asthma, and spent a lot of time in bed in my little room in my terraced house in Salford in the UK. I listened to the radio most days. It was the BBC mainly. Pirate radio started to come through later, but the BBC was dominant. So there was programs like the Big Band Show, Workers' Hour, and listening to lots of music from the 50s, 40s, and of course the little dribble that was coming through of American music, American rock and roll from 1957. I'm 5 years old, and I'm now listening to singers like Tommy Steele, Adam Faith, Billy Fury, and there was a programme on the television, and the televisions then were black and white and very small. There was a programme called the Old Boy Show, where all these young kids were being exposed on television. And straight away I had this affinity with Cliff Richard. Only being 5 or 6 years old, even then I knew that I had a very similar voice. So from the first releases, like Move It, Travelling Light, etc., I was hooked. As I got older, I started to perform myself. So at 15, I was now singing songs by Sinatra, by Tony Bennett, and slowly singing rock songs or pop songs. And of course, there was a big influence from the songs from Cliff Richard. As time goes on, and I get into my 20s, I'm working now professionally. My staple songs are mainly Cliff Richard songs. Cliff Richard was originally marketed as a rebellious rock and roll singer in the style of Elvis Presley, and Little Richard, who had a great influence on him, as well as Elvis Presley. Once the backing group came along, the Shadows, things changed a little bit, and they began, between them, the Shadows and Cliff, to dominate British popular music, until, of course, the Beatles came along, which was 1963-64. But in between times, from 1950, 57, 58, up to that time when the Beatles took over, his singles were top of the charts. He also starred in films, Espresso Bongo, The Young Ones, Summer Holiday. And I remember going to the theatre and seeing Summer Holiday 3 or 4 times in one day. And I fell in love with Una Stubbs, who was one of the main characters in Summer Holiday. Then I fell in love with Susan Hampshire, who appeared in Wonderful Life. Back to the girlfriends, back to Carol. Carol tells stories about beautiful parties with lots of lovely people, interesting people. But Cliff was always in my corner. He was cautious about talking to other women. I think he's always been scared of girls. When he started to get famous, all these fans were screaming and throwing themselves at him. It was hard for him to deal with it. Hard to work out who was real. Hard to work out who his real friends were. But to me, he was always nice, said Carol. Cliff used to go and visit my nan in hospital, she said. He would always put his dark glasses on and sneak in so no one would recognise him. And I'd go to his house in Chestnut, Hertfordshire, where he lived with his mum and dad. Or he'd come to mine. But as things changed for Cliff and Carol, June 1959 saw the marriage between Carol and Jet. The marriage to Jet Harris didn't last long, as Carol discovered he was being unfaithful. She was devastated. She phoned him while he was in Luxembourg on tour and said that was it. It was finished. Cliff rang me up to try and talk to me. He was just concerned for me, because Jet wasn't. She remembers the days when they headed off in the big red American car. They would kiss, cuddle and chat like school sweethearts. The radio was turned on, and the chances are that one of Cliff's songs were playing. It's no secret that Cliff was driven by his music career, and he's still driven today. At the age of 84, he wants to be the best. He was a performer. He wants to have more record sales than anybody else, more album sales, and he wants to tour until the day he dies. I qualify to tell these stories, I think, as I had quite a good association with Jet Harris when he was alive, because he was working with me and my band Vintage, and I had a long conversation with Cliff Richard some years ago and sang with him briefly, but we bonded, and it was a pleasure for me to meet somebody that mentored me throughout my life, somebody I could follow, somebody I could look up to. Cliff also had a relationship with a lady called Delia Wicks from Australia. He met her when he was on tour. The pair had been dating for 18 months. In a letter recently released, shows that Cliff wrote to her saying that his music career was more important than their relationship, and he wanted to give her the opportunity of finding somebody, getting married, and settling down in a normal relationship, rather than the career that he already could see before him. The letter was released just recently after the said lady, Delia Wicks, had passed away, and her brother found it in the belongings of Delia. Delia was part of the popular black and white minstrel show on TV at that time. She went on to marry a company director called John Pyle in 1970, but later divorced. She died at the age of 71. There are things you probably don't know about Cliff that I have a little snippet about, because during my time in my early days as a singer, I had Jet Harris in my band. And Jet Harris, of course, was the main or the bass player in the Shadows in the early years. They were on tour with Cliff, and they travelled, and they had quite a few experiences. So please subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and ring the bell, and make sure that you don't miss any future videos from me about Cliff Richard, other artists, or even items about Top Cat Radio, the fastest growing radio station in Europe.